webinar series. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're talking about capturing youth outcomes, an introduction to the Measurement Guidance Toolkit for mentoring programs. My name is Megan Terry. I'm from the Institute for Youth Success at Education Northwest, and I'll be co-hosting today's presentation. For those of you who have been part of this webinar series, you're familiar with this, but we just want to give you a reminder that this webinar series is part of some resources that are funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention through the National Mentoring Resource Center. And it's facilitated in partnership with Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, and with all these folks that you see listed here on the screen. These webinars would not be possible without this planning team, so we really want to thank those folks who support. Before we get started, I wanted to share some housekeeping information. In a week, you'll receive an email with some information about how to download a copy of these slides and view the webinar recording. You can also access this information directly by going to Mentor's website. To really continue to improve this series, we really appreciate your input. You'll receive a short survey right after the webinar, so please give a few minutes and share your feedback. We appreciate it. And as always, we try to make these as participatory as possible. So if you can use the question box to ask questions throughout the webinar. We have Dana Gold from the Mentoring Partnership of Southwestern Pennsylvania who's going to be queuing up your questions to share with our panelists during different Q&A portions of the webinar. We have, last time we checked, it was nearly 600 people registered for this session, so we may not be able to get to all your questions. But we're going to do our best. We've incorporated several Q&A sections, so we're going to do our best to try to get to those questions that do come up. To give you a chance to interact with the webinar format and to get a sense of who's joining us today, we have a couple short polls that we'll go ahead and launch right now. First, we'd just like to get a sense of your experience level in the field of mentoring. Would you call yourself a beginner, experienced, or expert? Go ahead and click on that option that best suits you. Great. So it looks like we have a majority of folks who consider themselves experienced in the field, a number of beginners, and some also experts on the line. We're really excited to have all of you. Thank you so much. And then in our second poll, we just want to get a sense of what do you consider your role in the mentoring field? Would you call yourself a practitioner, a researcher, a technical assistance provider, a funder, or something else? If you're in the other category, you can also use the chat panel to share how you describe your role in the field. Great. So this is really wonderful to see that the majority of folks on the call today are practitioners. This webinar information, the Measurement Guidance Toolkit, is going to be most relevant to you all, so I'm glad to see that that's the majority calling in. We do have a handful of researchers and technical assistance providers, a few funders, and quite a bit in that other category. So again, if you fall in that other, please do share a little bit more about your role in the chat panel. And thank you for starting with those first polls. Okay. So if you're familiar with really any level of mentoring research, then you're likely going to recognize today's panelists. We are really thrilled and excited to have two esteemed researchers in youth mentoring, Drs. David DuBois and Carla Herrera, joining our discussion today. If you're a regular participant in this webinar series, today's format may feel a little different though. With both Dr. DuBois and Dr. Herrera's knowledge in the field, we really wanted to give today's session a little bit more conversational tone, giving you a chance to ask questions and hear key pieces of advice on youth outcome measurement straight from the experts. So we're modeling this after FDR's fireside chat sort of format. So without further ado, we'll welcome our first panelist, Dr. David DuBois. As noted, Dr. DuBois has contributed to much of the literature on youth mentoring, including two landmark meta-analyses of the field, first in 2002 and the second in 2011. Meta-analyses are really helpful because if an effect shows up time after time in multiple independent studies, there's really greater evidence on a macro level that the effect really exists. So with his work, David has really supported the evolution of the field of youth mentoring. helping to establish best practice quality standards for programs. He's also been a key player in the development of the resource we're talking about today, the Measurement Guidance Toolkit, as he serves as the chair of the research board of the National Mentoring Resource Center. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the call, David.
Thanks very much. Glad to be part of it.
Great. And second, we have Dr. Carla Herrera. Thanks to the wonders of Skype, who's joining us all the way from Vienna. Like Dr. DuBois, Carla's mentoring scholarship has been really influential to the field. Following the 1995 Big Brothers Big Sisters impact study, in 2000, Dr. Herrera authored a study on mentoring school-age children, which really first examined some of the key differences between community and school-based mentoring. Expanding on these findings in 2004, Carla's article, A Closer Look at School-Based Mentoring, revealed some key cautions and considerations for school-based mentoring. And then a dozen years after the initial Big Brothers Big Sisters impact study, Carla and colleagues evaluated the effects of school-based mentoring. More recently, Carla directed the Mentoring at-Risk Youth Study, looking at the benefits of mentoring for youth with varying risk profiles. So, wow, Carla, that's quite an impressive contribution to the field. Thank you so much for your scholarship and for joining us today to talk about the Youth Measurement Toolkit and tips to measuring youth outcomes.
Thank you.
And then as your host, I'm joined today by who I would term a guru of translating research into practice, Michael Garringer of MENTOR. Mike's authored many resources to help mentoring practitioners implement quality services. And now, in really a most appropriate role, Mike oversees the research to practice projects with the National Mentoring Research Board, like the one that we're highlighting today, the development of the Measurement Guidance Toolkit for mentoring programs. And again, my name is Megan Terry. I'm with the Institute for Youth Success at Education Northwest, and I support mentoring and youth development programs mainly in the Pacific Northwest with training, technical assistance, and capacity building support. So again, just a reminder, you can enter your questions for our panelists at any time using the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. We do have a couple dedicated sections throughout the broadcast where we're going to pause for questions, but go ahead and enter those questions at any time, and we'll go ahead and queue them up for panelists to address during those sections. So I'm not going to keep you in suspense any longer. Let's go ahead and turn it over to Mike to help us frame today's discussion.
Great. Thank you, Megan, and thanks, David and Carla, for joining us, and to everyone in the audience for taking an hour and change out of your day to learn about this great new resource. I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time just framing what we'll be talking about today and why measurement is so important. Obviously, youth mentoring programs, like all youth serving programs, need to be able to demonstrate that what they're providing children and families is meaningful and impactful. But in my many years in this field, one of the things I've seen programs I think struggle with the most is how exactly to get those indicators that what you're doing is working. How do we measure our outcomes? How do we accurately find out about the youth we're serving and their families, and whether our services are having the impact we hope they are. And so to that end today, we'll be talking about a fantastic new resource that we've been working on for, probably half a year now, putting together. And so we're very excited to kind of roll this out to the field and introduce it to all of you. And I really want to take one last moment here to thank OJJDP for their interest in evaluating outcomes, not just for the programs that they directly fund, but for this entire field. As a federal agency, I think they care about measurement a great deal and have been very supportive of the development of this. So I just wanted to thank them one last time here for their investment in this type of resource. So I want to move on here a little bit, and I'm glad we're doing this fireside chat style today. I actually work out of my home and happen to be sitting right next to a fireplace, but there's no fire in it, so I already feel like perhaps I'm doing this wrong. But I want to bring David and Carla into the discussion here and talk about just kind of what's in this toolkit. We really focused on a couple of broad categories of things to measure. And so, David, I was hoping you could take a second to just talk a little bit about these two broad categories and also kind of when a program would want to think about measuring these things.
Thanks, Mike. So let's start with outcomes. And as you can see in the slide there, these are changes in individuals, in our case most commonly youth, as a result of participating in a program. And these can be attitudes, behaviors, or knowledge. And I would add to that they can be changes in their life circumstances. So that's an outcome as well. So one of the measures in the toolkit is whether the young person reports having a very important adult in their life. And of course, we're hoping as a first condition for impact in other areas that a young person going through a program would be more likely to endorse that. So let's not lose sight also of the kind of changing the context, if you will, of a young person's development. But those are the kind of the scope of outcomes. And risk and protective factors are the aspects of an individual that can hurt or help their ability to navigate life in healthy ways. And those can be things that are characteristics of an individual, as you see there, but also, again, their environments as well, of course, as you all know. And these can, to be a little bit technical, moderate outcomes or be outcomes themselves. And by moderate, we mean that they may be factors that lead, in this case, mentoring to be more or less impactful. So in some of the research that I've done that Megan was so nicely crediting and describing earlier, at the macro level, we see programs that serve youth from lower socioeconomic life circumstances seem to make more of a difference. That is, you compare mentored youth and non-mentored from those backgrounds after program participation, and they look more different than if you're taking kids with less disadvantage in their lives. But these can also be outcomes themselves. So one of the measures in the toolkit are symptoms of trauma exposure. And while those may be very important as to how a young person responds to mentoring, they can also themselves, particularly if a program were to be focusing on that and helping to do trauma-informed mentoring and helping young people to learn strategies for coping with any types of feelings of distress they may have or ongoing sources of potential adversity in their lives, that you could actually see a change in that. So the distinction here between what's outcome and what's one of the more kind of, say, background or moderating factors of risk and protection is not an absolute one.
Great, thanks, David. I was hoping you could also talk a little bit about kind of when programs would want to measure these types of things. We often think of outcomes as just being only at the end, but talk a little bit, if you could, about just when programs might consider using some of the measures that are in this kit.
Thanks, Mike, and sorry to have left that out. The outcomes, kind of early, I'm in Chicago, I'll say early and often, like they used to say about voting here. So you want to assess outcomes before program participation in order to have a baseline against which to understand whether there has been a change, which hopefully is in the positive direction and thus gives some evidence of beneficial impacts of the program after program participation. So that's the key aspect with outcomes. And we could go further and say, boy, it'd be wonderful if you could measure them farther down the road. So you could re-administer these kinds of measures in an alumni survey to youth on the outside, and you can also do it before the end of the program. Many of your programs are very long-term, and so you may want to do kind of interim assessments. So again, early, but also potentially often, but definitely pre and post at a minimum. And then on the risk and protector side, assuming that those are, for the most part, things that you're not expecting to be influenced by the program, but are important context for understanding the youth you're serving, both globally and at the individual level, you would want to assess those at the point when the youth is engaging and the family is engaging with services. So if something like, to go back to the trauma symptoms was particularly high, then you have some idea about the kinds of needs and considerations that may be important for that young person. In research that Carla and I did, Carla led the role of risk study, which you can Google and find. A big focus was getting an idea from mentors about the differing needs they saw on the ground when mentoring youth with different kinds of risk and protective factor profiles. But if you don't have that information and are systematically collecting it, it's tough to be either tailoring to individual youth or thinking about, wow, we're getting a lot of young persons in the program who don't seem to have any involvements in this protective factor of out-of-school time programs. How can we do something more systematically beyond telling the individual mentor to try to, as I did with my little guy, get him involved in Little League or something of that nature? So that's really a big plus, you know, if you can be measuring these things and utilizing them, and ideally at the point of service. And of course, you may want to check back in periodically to see how things have changed in order to continue to best serve that child, or maybe it's later in the program, something like Friends of the Children that serves youth from kindergarten to high school. You would want to have an idea of the changing risk and protective factor profiles of those youth at different points in their development.
Great. Thanks, David. You know, I want to take a little pulse from the audience here real quick. We've got one more poll to do, and I think as we were putting this webinar together, we wanted to kind of figure out where our audience was at in terms of the continuum of how ready you are or eager you are to start measuring youth outcomes. So take a second to choose the option here that best describes where you're at. I think if you're in the, if you think of a stages of change model, you know, pre-contemplation is we're kind of unaware of how to capture this outcome data. You know, contemplation would be, well, we're aware, but we're not quite ready to try. Preparation, you know, we're actively getting a plan together to do this. Action, we're doing it, we're ready to go here. And I think, you know, kind of the maintenance phase of the stages of change is, you know, we consistently do it, and it's an ongoing piece of our work, maybe one that we'd like to do better. So take a second here to kind of rate where your organization falls, or you as an individual might fall on this spectrum. So Jen, what do we got for results here? Okay, so good. A healthy percentage of you seem to be doing this consistently, and another big chunk of folks ready to kind of start diving into this and start developing a plan, and everyone else is kind of scattered across the other categories. I think this toolkit that we're talking about today will be beneficial to folks in all of these groups, including the folks that are already doing this pretty consistently. You may find that there's something in this toolkit that can help you do that work a little bit better. So thanks for kind of letting us know where you currently sit with all of this. So David, I wanted to ask just a few more questions before we show folks the toolkit here to kind of get at why this matters so much. And you know, you've had such great experience over the years working with programs, evaluating programs. You know, kind of in your opinion, what can go wrong for programs if they don't take the measurement aspect of doing an evaluation or looking at their program seriously? If they're not kind of doing it at the highest level, what are some of the things that can happen there?
Well, I can take that one. Did you want me to take that one, David?
Sure, go ahead, Carla. It'd be good.
Just kind of some of the mistakes that are often made out in the field. So many programs use kind of self-created or homegrown measures to assess their outcomes, and this can lead to several different problems. For example, one thing I see very often in homegrown measures is using just one question to measure some pretty complex constructs. Measuring attitudes and beliefs is really tricky because these constructs often have several dimensions. Think about, for example, depression. There's several different pieces of information I'd need to have a good sense for whether a child's really exhibiting depressive symptoms. If you ask children whether they've cried in the last week, they could have cried for all sorts of different reasons, but without several other pieces of information, I wouldn't necessarily call that a depressive symptom. Questions in homegrown measures are also often worded in a way that isn't crystal clear to respondents. So you may not be able to interpret their responses in the way that you'd like. So again, asking a child if they cried in the last week is different than asking whether they seem to cry more easily than usual lately. Researchers have done all this background work for you by creating measures that have been tested with youth to make sure they're reliable. That is, they get consistent results from one use to the other. And they also ensure that they're valid. So they're actually measuring what we hope to measure here, symptoms of depression versus crying. Another common mistake I see is that even when programs do go after tried and true measures, that they don't just fall in with a measure that seems like a great thing to affect but isn't really tied into their logic model. So it may be really neat to affect bullying behavior, but if you have a very targeted, academically focused program, that may not be the best outcome to try. And finally, even the best survey tools will not necessarily yield accurate, reliable information if you don't also pay attention to how you're administering these tools, but we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Great, thanks, Carla. Yeah, and I think, you know, really stressing the idea that programs need to be using measures that have been tested for their reliability and validity. I think that's the key. We're going to talk a little bit more later in this webinar about, you know, the rules around rewording questions that you find in a validated tool and how to accommodate for ages and things like that. David, do you have anything to add here around kind of what are some of the common mistakes programs can make around measurement?
I really don't. I'll say just one that I just at a slightly higher level than the great issues that Carla highlighted is not investing the amount of time in your program delivery and design that is going to be needed to really both collect the data and to analyze it, you know, and make use of it. You put so much hard work into designing your programs and, of course, making them successful and safe experiences for young people that it pains me to some extent to see then the measurement side not get the attention that may be necessary to be able to reliably detect the benefits that you all are providing to young people. So, you know, it's really something that I know that you're often at the mercy of funders who'll say no funds for evaluation or, you know, small percentage at most, and those kinds of challenges. But you know, hopefully this toolkit makes it at least an area where you have to invest somewhat less time and effort to be able to really do a top-notch job.
Great, thanks, guys. So I think, you know, there's all these issues that can happen when programs aren't using the right tool to measure, you know, what it is they think their outcomes should look like. And I think our goal with this toolkit was to really help you find tools that are reliable, valid, and in this case, ones that were really recommended as being a good fit for mentoring. So I think at this point, Jen, I'd like to start showing folks the toolkit itself. And for folks that want to go take a look at this, hopefully when we're done with the webinar, not in the middle of it, but if you can't help yourself, I don't blame you for going and taking a look. It can be found on the National Mentoring Resource Center website, which is at nationalmentoringresourcecenter.org. It's a long URL, but it's the one we liked best. And if you go to the Learning Hub section of that website, you can just find that in the main navigation, you'll see a link that will take you to a page that looks very much like this. And this is the landing page for the kit itself. And you know, the purpose of this, like I said, has really been to provide well-vetted recommendations for instruments that are a good fit for mentoring. And we really think that this will not only help you more consistently capture outcomes of what your program's doing with young people, but I think ideally, as you know, and Carla and David as researchers, I think you would agree that one of our frustrations in this field is that it's hard to compare outcomes across programs. And so I think in a very long-term view for the mentoring field, we're hoping that this will lead to more programs using the same measures to measure outcomes, and that'll make it easier for David to do the next meta-analysis that he's going to do, or just make it easier for researchers to compare what programs seem to be most effective at achieving certain outcomes. So there's both some practical reasons for your individual programs, but also some kind of macro level reasons for our field as a whole. I want to give a shout out quickly here to the development team that worked on this. You can see the names here on the screen, and it's a real who's who of kind of, who's, this isn't our full research board for the project, for the NMRC, but it's a significant chunk of our members, and for many of the topic areas that this toolkit addresses, many of these folks are the best in the field, or some of the best in our field around looking at these types of outcomes. And so it was a really stellar group of individuals that helped pull this together. And also a shout out to our partners at First Pick, who managed the NMRC website for us, specifically Mandy Howard, who did a really great job of building what you guys will see when you get to the kit. So I want to talk a little bit about the process we went through of developing this. Folks are probably wondering, well, okay, you guys put this together, like how did you go about doing it, and what did you consider when recommending one of these instruments? We met as a group and just kind of started by really trying to figure out what are the main buckets of outcomes that we think youth mentoring programs are best suited to achieve. We also, once again, looked at those risk and protective factors as part of that. Those are an important part of the equation, but we really just tried to say, okay, we had to categorize the outcomes that we think mentoring is best at. What would those buckets be, and then kind of what would be the subcategories within each. Once we nailed down those subcategories, members nominated multiple instruments or scales within each of those outcomes, and then they nominated a small handful that were really whittled down using a scoring rubric that looked at many factors that we thought were important. And David, I want to pause here and see if you want to say a few words about some of the criteria that we used when selecting these recommended measures.
Sure, thanks, Mike. Well, of course, reliability and validity stemming from everything we've said thus far. So they had to be technically sound and have gone through a strong process of being tested for those two things. But equally important was that they be also practically useful. And that involved being available and free. They have ease of use and brevity. So they didn't involve extensive, there's plenty of good scales out there to assess probably scores a young person's social competence, but we knew or anticipated that you would most likely want to be getting at that, the average program, in just a handful of questions, with limitations understood in terms of that it won't be as nuanced or perhaps even the utmost perfect assessment, but that in the context of mentoring, which so often is intended to address many different outcome areas, you can only usually devote a certain number of questions to a given outcome. And also the ages of youth. So if a measure was very tailored to just 10 to 12-year-olds, then that was not something that was viewed favorably. We tried to get measures that, where appropriate and feasible, could cover as much of the age range of the kind of school-age young people that mentoring programs tend to work with.
Great, thanks, David. So once we kind of scored multiple measures within a category, if you could move to the next slide, Jim. Team members then really recommended in each category one instrument, one scale that we thought was the best. There's a lot of compendia out there of evaluation instruments, and you'll often find that when you get to any one category, they recommend 20 different things, and it's nice to have some variety, but we kind of felt for programs that was even more confusing, because then it becomes, well, which of these 20 measures of, say, depressive symptoms would I pick? I don't know. And so we really tried to simplify that here and really based our recommendations on the criteria that David just noted, and really tried to just nail it down. In a few instances, we do provide an alternative in case, the instrument is for a narrower slice of youth age ranges, for example. But for the most part, we picked ones that we thought would fit most of your programs, provided that you do work that would impact that outcome. We also then had our team members write up a very nice short essay around each of those big buckets, and we'll go through what each of those are in a second. But those are really great essays that explain kind of our thinking behind what goes into, say, healthy behavior or academic success. What are the measures that we thought fit under that category. We also provided a lot of good wraparound content. There's all kinds of great advice on here about how to administer instruments, and a little bit of advice about how to use these tools within the context of a program evaluation. And then finally, OJJDP review and sign off, and then website development, and today's webinar, I think, is the final step in this development process. So let's take a look at what's in the toolkit. When you first get to the toolkit, you'll notice that there's some side navigation on the left-hand side of the screen. That will kind of help you just click around within the toolkit. Think of it as a little mini website within the larger NMRC website. And if you click on any of the measurement domain categories, you'll see a little pop-down menu drop down. First thing you'll see is a link to that domain overview. So for mental and emotional health, we talk a little bit about why we think mentoring programs can impact that, a little bit about the history, the research that kind of shows mentoring programs can be impactful in that broad area. And then under that, you'll see links to the specific outcomes within the category of mental and emotional health. And you can see the 6 kind of broad buckets here on the slide, from mental and emotional health all the way down to academics, and then there's a 7th category, which is those risk and protective factors we've been talking about. So I want to go and show folks the specific kind of measures that are in each of these big bucket areas, and I'm not going to read every one of these. You can see them on the slide. And I would say as we go through these, if you see something that you think belongs in one of these categories that is perhaps missing here, feel free to type that into the question panel. If you want to know kind of why we picked social competence under social emotional skills, but not other things, we can talk about that as we go along, or if you have a recommendation for something to add to one of these categories, we can certainly talk about that as well. And so most of the measures that you'll see, we have 4 or 5 in most categories here: mental and emotional health, social emotional skills. If you move to the next slide, Jen, we also have the broad category of healthy and pro-social behavior. And that includes, things that I've seen mentoring programs recently really do nice work around, things around physical activity and healthy eating, and as well as more traditional things like pro-social behavior. We also looked at problem behavior, both kind of aggression, school misbehavior, so a few categories there. Moving on to interpersonal relationships, we really wanted to make sure we provided some things that looked at mentees' other relationships with folks. Gene Rhodes' conceptual model of mentoring often proposes that outcomes of mentoring kind of happen more or less because they improve, your mentoring relationship improves how you're getting along with others in your life. So we've got things that look at parent-child relationship quality, peer relationship quality, other factors, and then certainly academics, looking at academic performance, feelings of school connectedness, and so forth. And then lastly, for those risk and protective factors, we wanted to look at some of the things that we thought, if I'm running a mentoring program, what might I want to know about the young people that I'm serving? And as David noted at the beginning, making changes on these scores for a young person could also be seen as an outcome in and of itself. But we really wanted to provide some scales that we thought would help you both design better services for youth and really just kind of give a better understanding of what the risk and protective factors young people and families are bringing to the program. So on the next slide, for each of these measures, so any one that you click on, you'll basically pull up a little profile of that instrument, and there's 28 total of these at this point. We'll be adding more as we go on over time. But for each of these profiles, we provide quite a bit of information that will be useful to you as the end user, not just kind of what this measure is and the intended age range, but also a little bit about why we picked this particular one, some cautions for using it based on previous uses of this instrument in research, instructions on how to actually use the thing and score it, how to interpret those findings, and then, perhaps most importantly, where to get it. And for most of these, you can download the scale itself directly from the toolkit. In a few cases, we send you to a link on a different website to download the questions themselves. But we really wanted to make this as easy for you, the end user, as possible. And really the goal of this is to just simply put good tools for measuring outcomes into your hands directly. And so I think for the most part you'll find that all of these instruments are very readily available to you. And I mentioned earlier, in a few cases we've recommended an alternative if the scale that we recommended was used in kind of limited research, or if there's a really good alternative that was a solid second place finish to the one we recommended. In a few instances we've provided links to some alternatives too, but we really stuck to our guns about wanting to make sure that we recommended one instrument and just kind of take the ambiguity out of it, hopefully for mentoring programs. So just take a look here quickly at what one of these profiles looks like on the site. So if you click down, say you wanted to measure whether youth in your program have greater, kind of overall life satisfaction after participating in your program, and you click on the life satisfaction link, you'll get a profile that looks a lot like this. And the big blue box there kind of at the top is a very succinct description of what exactly this instrument measures. And so I think this will make it very easy for folks to find exactly what they're looking for in the kit. You'll know kind of right away whether this life satisfaction instrument is a good fit for you. But certainly I encourage folks to read through these profiles, at some level of detail if you're thinking about using one of these scales. There's a lot of good information here that will help you determine whether these are a good fit for you. But wait, there's more. I feel like I'm on an infomercial. In addition to just providing links to all of this stuff and all of this information about these instruments, as I said before, we've also provided quite a bit of advice for designing and administering measurement tools. There's a really great FAQ section that really asks, many of the questions that I've heard from programs over the years and provides real detailed answers. David put together a really fantastic list of kind of tips to remember for using these in a program evaluation. So there's a few really good, insightful things around just how to incorporate measures into an overall evaluation design. And then, as much as we like this toolkit, it's not, the only thing out there. And so we do provide some links to other recommended reading and resources. And I believe next week sometime we'll also be putting up a glossary of terms, recognizing that many of you on this call are not researchers or evaluators by trade, and you may have questions about some of the terminology used in these domain write-ups and these instrument profiles. So if you don't know what a comparison group is, or terminology like that, we'll have a little glossary of terms that will hopefully help folks make a little bit more sense of all that information. So I think in the future, as we go forward with this kit, we're always looking to add more instruments to this. Over time, we had to kind of take a judicious slice of of what was possible here, but certainly don't think of this toolkit as being fully comprehensive at this stage. We can always add more things to it. This was just kind of our first slice of the ones that we thought were perhaps most prominent for the majority of mentoring programs. So I would say if folks have a suggestion for a new category or a new measure to add to this, once you've looked at it a little bit, or based on the quick run through we just did, be sure to type that in the Q&A panel here. And I know that we've covered a lot of ground to this point in the webinar, so I want to pause here and really take some time for some Q&A with folks. So Megan and Dana, why don't you see what the audience wants to know about here?
Well, we've got a lot of gratitude coming in, Mike. This is Dana, and so many people are saying they're so excited about this, they're really grateful for this is what they need. There is a lot of questions, of course, about what exactly is in the tool, and are there measures for self-efficacy versus measures for future orientation versus measures for people, youth who perhaps have intellectual disabilities. How adaptable is this tool going to be for a wide variety of programs? Can we talk about that for a minute?
I can take a stab at that one, Mike.
Yep.
So I heard two. Well, first of all, it's gratifying to hear the gratitude. So thank you, and we hope that it really will play out in the ways that you're seeing it having the potential to in your work. With regard to the first of the two issues that I heard, or the questions, one was, what about another outcome, such as, for example, a young person's feelings of self-efficacy, or also one we considered self-esteem. Both of those were ones that were absolutely in the running for this relatively limited number of outcomes, in this case within the emotional mental health realm, that we were able to really do diligence on. And so as we look toward this being a living document, I can already tell you that those are two that are up for inclusion in the next round. And we hearing that from you all, it just adds to our ability to make good choices. With regard to adapting to special populations, diverse populations, such as the one that was mentioned, youth with intellectual disabilities, there is not an effort underway, nor one plan to try to tackle that particular issue. Those are pretty specialized and challenging ones that would really require an investment of time and resources that, from my standpoint, I don't anticipate us having. We certainly are trying to be mindful of considerations such as cultural appropriateness that may well apply to a broad range of programs, that measures don't have implicit assumptions about what social competence looks like, for example, that aren't reflective of differences across cultures. And we look for validation research, in fact, that helps us feel confident that the measure works and is acceptable to diverse groups. But when you get into particular, very specialized groups that make up, frankly, a small percentage of the overall youth population, I don't anticipate us doing a lot there to develop fully adapted versions of these measures or guidance.
Yeah, and I will just add to that. I mean, I think, I hinted at this earlier, that I believe our overall mindset around a lot of this was fairly, I guess, utilitarian in nature, kind of a greatest good for the greatest number of programs. But we knew that, for, programs that are doing kind of, very targeted and specific work with specific groups of young people, that, not every recommendation we make is going hit the mark for folks. But I think what you'll find in those profiles is enough information that will help you as a practitioner, determine like, yeah, I think this one would be okay to use. I can also tell you that we debated these, recommendations, very deeply. There was a lot of hours and a lot of emails back and forth about, and in some cases we wound up tossing out measures that are very popular and in wide use out there because we felt there was something about the scale itself that, as David said, was either culturally kind of either insensitive or not appropriate, or we just felt like there was something kind of problematic with it. And so we really did put a lot of effort into trying to recommend tools that would have the broadest applicability. I'll also add quickly, though, that this National Mentoring Resource Center project at its heart is a training and technical assistance project. And through this project, any program in the country, including everyone on this call, can apply for free help and free technical assistance around exactly this type of question. So if you start exploring this toolkit and are really wondering like, hey, based on the youth I serve and what my program's all about, I'm just not quite sure whether this instrument is a great fit for us or not. Request some technical assistance. We'll hook you up with a TA provider that, will be able to answer that question and provide a little bit deeper individualized help. That's, a huge part of what this project is all about. So, think of this toolkit as perhaps a starting point on some of that work. But certainly on a program-by-program basis, there's a lot to figure out, but the good news is you can get help with that through this project.
Great. There is another question about how do you get buy-in from the people who will be doing or approving the process of evaluation. For instance, if you're working with a school district that is hesitant to have students or answer these kinds of questions about themselves, how do you get around that kind of obstacle? And I know this is a more difficult question to answer from the research standpoint, but more practical. How do you enlist and engage the supportive parents to have you answering these kinds of questions? And what do we do about any kind of third-party observation? Are there questionnaires for teachers or parents that could be used if students aren't given aren't really given permission to answer the questionnaires themselves?
David or Carla, either of you want to take that one?
That's a tough one. I think when we wrote up our justification for example, why academic performance was important or why a particular measure was important, we tried to pull from all sorts of literature to say, well, why is this something that you really need to measure, that you really want to understand in the youth in your program? And so hopefully those justifications will help programs a little bit with that justification piece. I think also thinking about kind of teacher reports and parent reports is also really smart. Ideally, we would have made the toolkit also have that, but that was a whole other realm that we didn't want to get into. But that's also a really smart way to try to dive into some of the issues that schools may not be comfortable asking about, or your partners or whoever in the community. Yeah.
I would just add very briefly that we might be able to also add something to our FAQs around this issue that might be helpful and use, depending on what the concerns are. So for example, there are folks who may think that asking certain questions will suggest those behaviors, for example. So if we're asking kids about whether you're bullying other kids, will that give them the idea of, hey, I could do that if I really wanted to get back at that person or what have you. That question comes up, and the research is very clear about that. And the answer is no. There's just no evidence that asking young people about whether it be something like feelings of depression or even thoughts of wanting to end their life, that asking the question doesn't move them in that direction. So I think there are some things we could put our heads to that might be useful in anticipating and providing at least some ammunition, for lack of a better word, for you all as you go about negotiating with your stakeholders around what will be acceptable and seen as appropriate.
And I just want to ask a quick follow-up question related to that. So we're going to talk in a minute about whether it's okay for folks to kind of tweak the instruments that they find in the toolkit and kind of the do's and don'ts around that. David and Carla, in your opinion, can some of these instruments and sets of questions be modified to ask them of a third party's perspective on that? So a survey that's designed for a young person to directly answer, could a program perhaps change the wording of that and ask it of that child's parent? So instead of
that, yeah, no, thanks, Mike. And that would not be advisable from my perspective. I think a better approach there would be to seek out some technical assistance as needed and identify measures that have been developed for that purpose. They do tend to, certainly overlap when you look at measures, for example, for social competence or picking up on a young person's self-efficacy or what have you. But they're also fairly different, taking into account what is a teacher or a parent likely to observe and be able to report on, for example, and the wording may be able to be more nuanced when you're talking to, for example, an education professional. And so those things, really are useful. Carla, would you feel similar, or would you have a different take?
I completely agree. No, I agree, David.
I had one more question if we have time for that.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. One of the other questions that we had was how do you figure out how to determine the difference between doing an evaluation, for instance, in a peer mentoring program? Are there different tools? Because part of the effect you want to see is on the peer mentors themselves. Some programs might be very interested in teasing out their mentors' outcomes. Is there anything within the toolkit that helps measure that or evaluate the mentor's experience?
I can take that one, at least the first crack at it. The good news is on the peer mentoring side, since we're talking about other young people, yes, these measures are not specific, nor do they assume that they're being responded to by a young person who is a mentee. They're really designed and have been used with young people in general in charting their development and their well-being. So that's good news in the case of peer mentoring. Of course, as to echo Carla's point about your logic model, you might lead to different outcomes that you expect for a peer mentor versus a mentee of that mentor or another type of mentor. The issue of adult mentors, older mentors, college and older, no, these measures are generally not going to be appropriate for them. And from your lips to OJJDP's ears and other funders, we think we've got a pretty good model here that could easily be adapted and applied to another realm of outcomes such as that. And I would be eager and ready to pursue it.
Okay. Thanks, Dana, for queuing up those questions for us. And don't worry, we still have another section that we will open it up for more questions from the audience. But right now we want to move to what we're calling the lightning or speed round of questions. So David and Carla, we have a series of common questions to youth outcome evaluation that we're hoping each of you can address as richly and, of course, as succinctly as possible. We know this may not be an easy task of researchers, but we're all going to go ahead and put our growth mindset hats on and see how we do. So you each will have roughly a minute to respond to the question before a really obnoxious buzzer is sounded and you're cut off. There actually is no buzzer, but really just give us the Cliff Notes version of your answers. Okay, so we'll start, David, with you. As folks think about using the scales made available through this kit, they're likely going to want to combine them into bigger surveys that gets at all the different things they want to measure. Can you give us a sense of what's a reasonable number of questions for a youth survey?
The $64,000 question, to take another game show metaphor or analogy. That's a hard one. And with regard to that, I think you really, of course, will need to adapt to your youth population and circumstances. However, as a rule of thumb, in my own opinion, I would encourage programs to consider investing at least as much time in collecting what I would regard as structured information that you get from surveys as you do unstructured information, semi-structured, in the form of youth interviews, say when they come into a program. So if you normally spend 20 minutes talking to each young person to get an idea of who they are and what their hopes are for their participation in the program and interest and such, then I would say this merits and would be fine for them. It will seem like a fair deal to spend about that same amount of time to provide more structured information about themselves. And I would frame it in just that way, that you're obviously in helping them, letting them know they're contributing to this program, which needs to understand how people do as they go through it. So a lot of it amounts, not everything, but a lot of it does amount, I think, to young people. That question, which I get from my middle school daughter, so why? Why am I being asked to do this?
Great. And Carla, same question to you. What do you suppose is a reasonable number of questions for a youth survey?
So I wouldn't go by number of questions. So 100 questions can take a lot of time or not so much time depending on what the questions are. But I'm with David. I would try to stay, in general, as a rule of thumb, under 30 minutes, so ideally under 20 for your youth surveys. Also remember that younger children will take longer to respond than older kids, so if older children are taking 30 minutes on your survey, it's probably too long. A couple other things I would think about when you're putting together all of these scales. Think about question placement. So I tend to ask more basic questions up top, like age and gender and ethnicity, to kind of warm up youth and adults to your questions. The really tricky questions, like delinquent behavior, I tend to move toward the end of my surveys because those are the ones that may make kids clam up and not want to answer any more questions. I also try to close my surveys with something really positive so kids walk away feeling good, or I sometimes insert filler questions and scales about negative behaviors so that kids can feel okay about talking about the negative things they've done because they're also reporting on the positive things. And lastly, remember when you combine things up, your scale introductions matter. So try to stick with the scale introductions suggested by the authors. Often these things note things like there are no right or wrong answers, or different kids feel different ways about things. We just want to hear how you feel. These introductions can make a difference in how children approach the questions.
And don't be afraid to ask your young people at the end of it a question at the end of your survey. So, what were your feelings about doing this survey? And a couple good questions. I actually had a doctoral student actually develop a little small scale about that, but you could just come up with your own questions. So don't assume things, positive or negative, I think, in how young people will experience being asked these questions.
Thank you both. Those are some really helpful tips to keep in mind. And I think it's also emphasizing for folks the importance of actually testing these tools before you go ahead and rely on them as the main tool or youth outcome survey that you're going to use. Try it on some of your students or your youth population and see how they respond, see how well it goes. Okay, so on to the second question. And we've touched on this a little bit, but can users change the wording of questions or drop questions that they don't like from scales that they find in the toolkit? David, let's hear from you first.
Oh, wow. This is a hard one. And the answer is both yes and no, in that if you have a compelling reason that you can identify to change or drop an item, then that is something that's definitely not to be ignored. I'll give an example of a measure around family management. It may even be the one we recommended, but we recommended it with this item taken out. The item was, in our family, it seems like it's a zoo. Okay, so I probably don't have to fill in the blanks about why that could be construed, as a very insensitive thing, likening people to animals and things like that. So at the time this measure was developed, that notion may not have been out there as much, what have you. So if you see an item like that, we tried to take measures that didn't have those kind of obvious, problems. Then I think that's appropriate. If you whittle down, there's no magic number, but when you start to get to like 4 or fewer items to get to a given thing, like what your relationship is like with your parent, we find that those tend to not perform very well and won't give you the sensitivity. There's no magic number on that. But if you're talking about an 8-item scale and taking one item off because it just felt insensitive or inappropriate or just non-relevant, that's one thing. I'll let Carla reply. I know I didn't get to the wording issue, but she may touch on that.
Great.
So my answer is definitely more no than yes. So usually the scale developers went to great pains to word things in a very specific way to be able to measure the construct you're after. But in cases like the example David's raising, if you come up to cases where you feel a substantive change is really needed, like you want to drop an item or you want to change the wording, I've often gone to the scale developer to see what they think. Or actually you might need to rethink the use of that scale. So it could be that you might find a scale that's reliable and valid, but just closer to what you really want to measure. It's more appropriate for the youth you serve or the context you serve them in. I would really think about that before I start messing around with a scale that's already been well validated.
I agree.
Okay, so for the most part, really stick with the scale. Don't change any of the wording. That can really compromise the reliability and validity. And if you can, check with the developer if there's one of those substantive challenges. Okay, so moving on to our next question. What if youth in a program are slightly younger or older than the recommended age ranges listed for a scale? Can practitioners stretch the age limit any?
I guess I'm going first on this too.
Yeah.
That's one that, as we note there may be, in general thinking about this, less concern with going slightly upward because at least you know that there won't be literacy or comprehension issues introduced by going downward, where even if the construct, something like self-efficacy or self-esteem is perfectly valid, the wording, I can think of the Rosenberg self-esteem measure, I feel like a person of worth on an equal plane with others, and that's an item that probably, what do you mean plane? Am I supposed to be taking an airline trip? So, that's not going to be probably even by a teenager, but, so you can see that can be a concern going downward. But even upward, you're going to end into the possibility that the items themselves just don't get at what that means to be socially competent, say, as a 16-year-old versus a 10-year-old. And the wording itself may seem childish, and thus may give some blowback from the youth. So an item on a social competence measure that's for younger children, I think the one we recommend, is I can wait my turn patiently in line. Now, granted, it's true, on my commute every day into work, I see adults who violate that, but still, in a sensitive teenager may see like, oh my God, it sounds like you're talking about elementary school.
Okay.
I completely agree, David. So I think in cases where you see, and again, we mentioned a lot of these in the toolkit where it would be problematic going either up or down, but when you think about changing an example within, this is a case where I think you could make a good argument for just changing an item. If you change an example within that item, I don't see a big problem with that. Instead of referring to sharing toys or playing with friends, something different like hanging out with friends or something. But But once you start making a lot of those changes again, get in touch with the developer just to see what they think, and that you haven't inadvertently changed something fundamental about the measure. So just try to be really careful, even with these small changes like that, that might be making it more age appropriate.
Okay, moving along. If I'm looking to see if my program has made an impact, should I always administer surveys pre and post, or at the beginning and end of a program, or can I just do it at the end of the year? If I didn't survey folks when they started, is it too late? I'll start with David again. Are you there, David?
Might be muted, David. All right. Can you hear me now? I'm sure. So in all cases, wherever possible, give pre and post, because then you have that starting point. Unfortunately, even with pre and post, you're going to be greatly compromised in many cases to detecting an effect of your program. The public-private venture study of community-based mentoring back from the 90s that was such a catalyst for the field would have concluded in many areas that mentoring was harmful had they only done pre and post. Because what happens when young people get older, they tend to feel that and are doing a little less well in school. They get involved in a little more problem behavior like substance use experimentation. So if you don't have a comparison group, which kind of goes over to those tips that Mike mentioned, you're really, really on thin ice trying to make inferences, and you may actually be faced with perplexing findings. That said, pre and post is certainly a lot better than post only. At least you've got a baseline to start with. There are some more advanced techniques and strategies where you, at post-test, ask people to go back and think about where they were at the start of the program. And those are certainly something to think about if you're forced into a corner, such as the program's already started and you can't do pre.
So I would add that the problem with post-test data alone is that when you ask respondents, how much do you think you've benefited from the program in the following areas, their responses are going to be influenced by a whole host of things, maybe in part by how much they truly benefited, but also by, for example, how good their relationship is with you, how much they think you'll benefit from their saying that they got a lot out of the program, and how they feel about their mentor or their mentee. I really like her, so I want to give her a pat on the back. And generally, people are really bad at saying just how much they've changed over time. So you're likely to get responses that have little to do with the actual benefits they got from the program. Funders are really starting to get much more savvy about evaluation design, and thus they're also likely to see one-time point tests as really problematic for these reasons.
Okay, and then one more question before we open it up to the audience again. There are also lots of considerations for actually administering surveys. So, for example, programs often wonder about how to best ask youth or mentors to provide information, whether that's verbally or online with paper or pencil. What should programs think about when they're administering surveys? Carla, let's start with you first.
Well, to the extent possible, youth should complete their survey in private, either online or on paper, but with staff reading the questions out loud. So some children may have difficulties reading, but they would never want to say so. So it's best to assume all children need help reading as a baseline. But the children shouldn't say their answers out loud, as would be done in a phone survey. There's a lot of research showing that youth and adults, in fact, are less likely to disclose sensitive information about their behavior, feelings, or life experiences if they need to say their responses out loud to the person who's administering the survey. Think about how likely a child is to respond honestly to a question about substance use when asked on a private survey versus responding out loud to their case manager who they know well and want to please. Staff can also consider offering youth a dictionary of terms that are in the survey, so that if youth have a question about what a word means, the same even-handed definition is always offered to them. I've often used these in my work, and I'm happy to share an example with whoever would like to see that. Finally, it's also important that you let youth know who will and who won't see their responses. In research, we assure children that their responses won't be seen by anyone except the research team. This is really helpful to ensure honest responses. But if you plan to have your staff use their responses, you need to tell them up front who will see their responses and what you'll do with them.
Anything to add, David?
Real quickly, I know we're getting short on time. One of the key things about having youth verbalize their answers that's problematic is that often that happens after a paper and pencil administration for pretest. So if you're asking about sensitive, problem, or delinquent behaviors, lo and behold, they report less at post, but in fact, that very well could be entirely an artifact of now having to kind of put out there in words the information.
Okay, thanks you guys. It was really helpful to hear some of those high-level tips, and I appreciate you keeping that as succinct as possible. So let's take another couple minutes, Dana, and open it back up to audience questions. So now's your chance. Go ahead and engage with Carla or Dr. DuBois and ask more questions.
Well, we have a couple more here. One would be, what about youth who speak different languages or are non-readers or non-speakers of the English language? Is it possible to use a scale that's similar to what they use for a pain scale in a hospital with the smiley faces or and the frowny faces? What do you do and how do you adapt this for non-English speakers or people who are non-readers?
That's a great question. I'll offer a couple quick thoughts. First, we tried to, as much as possible, select measures that were already available in at least Spanish, in some cases a number of other languages, like Michael Karcher, many of you know, is a very prolific mentoring researcher, has also developed one of the the cutting-edge measures of young people's sense of connectedness and positive engagement with different parts of their lives, like their school peers and family. And that measure has been picked up and utilized in many contexts and now has many versions available. That's much more preferable than trying to adapt to kind of a whole different measure format and develop your own. So that would be one thought there. The other is you can invest, and again, you would want to check with the measure developer. First, they may even have something you're not aware of, but also just to kind of see if they had issues about it. But to get to the language of a group that you're serving, and invest in the translation process, and there are professionals at that, and that's the kind of thing that technical assistance could help you with. But if that's a key issue, then there are ways of addressing it, but trying to develop your own scale, that would almost be more something I would imagine with intellectual disabilities, where the actual cognitions may be difficult for the young person. But if it's a language consideration, which is what I was hearing, then I would by all means try to get it in the language of that young person.
I would also add too in translation that it's really important to get not just a translator, but a person who's translated surveys for youth. Like, I've worked with a number of different translators, and some of them are really super duper wonderful, and IRB folks and all that look at their survey and they say, yeah, this makes sense. Others translate things very literally. Even the term mentor in Spanish can be tricky. So just be very careful, have second readers and all that, just to make sure your translation looks really good.
Right, one final question if we want to jump on this one. There are some programs that are not once a week, 4 hours a month, that kind of standard, year-long. How appropriate are these tools going to be for programs that have a lighter frequency or a less regular contact between mentor and mentee in terms of outcomes?
They should be entirely appropriate, assuming that the program is intending to address outcomes in these areas. If it's not, then of course, going back to Carla's point about the logic model, then it won't be. I think that really goes to question about the program. If your program is such that you may be committed to providing young people with a positive experience through mentoring, and say, at the intensity with which we can do this, we're not anticipating that we're going to move the needle in a measurable way, knowing that these measures are always going to be fallible to some extent already. Then this doesn't make sense to be trying to measure or if there's different outcomes you think your program is suitable for. So always go back to that logic model, that theory of change, whatever term if you don't have that, invest the time in developing that. We can definitely through the NMRC hook you up with really good practical resources, but that's the starting point.
Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you both so much, Dr. DuBois and Dr. Carla Herrera, for answering all these questions. I know there's probably still a ton more questions that came through that we didn't get a chance to address, but perhaps we can comb through those and use that to inform some of the FAQ information on the actual toolkit site itself. So just a couple reminders before we let you go for the day. Again, you can get this no-cost technical assistance for your mentoring program through the National Mentoring Resource Center. And this is, again, funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention and facilitated in partnership with Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. So no matter where you're located in the U.S., this resource is available to you. So definitely look into that. We also really encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to register your program with the Mentoring Connector. This is a national database of mentoring programs. And it's folks can log in and search for mentoring programs and opportunities by zip code across the country. And this can help you connect to other national movements. So please go ahead and put your program information in there if you haven't already. Again, after the webinar, a week after this webinar, you're going to receive an email with a link to the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series webpage, and we'll post the webinar recording, slides, and additional resources. So a few people have asked, are you going to get this information in the future? So yes, it's not going anywhere. You will have access to this, and we will send you a reminder as soon as it's available. And also don't forget, we really appreciate your feedback. So if at the end of the webinar, if you can fill out this short survey that'll pop up for you. Again, this just really helps us follow our commitment to continuous improvement and see how we can strengthen these resources for you. And again, stay connected. Be sure to visit the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series page on Mentor's website, and you can access a whole host of really valuable webinars that have been archived on there. And you'll also see information about upcoming webinars. Speaking of which, the next webinar coming up on October 20th will be on corporate sponsorship. Or strategic partnerships, I guess is the language we're using now. So this actually is some really helpful information in that session that I'm excited to learn more about. I hope you can join us then. And thank you, everyone, for your participation today. This was a really helpful resource we were excited to share with the field. Thanks a lot and have a great day.